Thank you, Robin, and hello, everybody. We're very lucky because we're a little short of time and we have technical problems, so it'll mesh in so that we will probably end up being on time. But I will need you to use your imagination because I'm talking to what should have been pictures, but they're not. What I want to do is try to unfold the issues of democracy, leadership, and conflict, particularly that's happening in our world today. I'm talking really about the issue here with Europe and Britain leaving Europe and over in the United States and how that is seen from the developing world. Over in the States, we have Donald Trump. Is there anybody here that has not heard of him? Do I have to explain who he is? No? Good, good. I'll tell you the story. I met Donald Trump twice. I met him about 20 years ago. He was in Hong Kong selling his yacht. And we were sitting in a big office overlooking the harbour, and his yacht was down there, and I was interviewing him, and me and him in the room, and he'd just sold it, and there was a knock on the door. And it opens, and his lawyer's looking around, and then somebody pushes through the lawyer, and the guy comes in and he throws a piece of paper down on the coffee table between us and says, "How dare you do this to me?" They're both Americans. I think that the yacht buyer was from California. And Trump said, you didn't read the contract properly. And it turns out that he had sold his yacht for however many millions of dollars it was, but he hadn't sold the license to the yacht, like selling a car without the number plate. So the buyer had gone down to Hong Kong Harbour to try to take the yacht off to Manila or somewhere and wasn't allowed to leave. And Trump said, yeah, well, I usually do that to people. There's always something they don't find in the contract. And he was just like he is now. His hair was like that. His mouth was sort of curled like that. And he was sort of spitting at you when you spoke. And he said, okay, but since the media are here, that's me, I usually sell that for an extra $1 million, but I'll give it to you for 100,000. They were both multimillionaires, and the guy had no choice but to buy it. When he left, Trump turned to me and said, "See what I mean there? That's a Trump deal. That's the art of the deal." And I said to him as a question, that's before he wrote the book, I said to him as a question, I said, "So a businessman's deal is to upset the customer?" And he didn't really get an answer. I saw him actually later. There was some event at a hotel in New York, and we were all queuing up to do it, and he was sort of like there behind me. And I turned around to him and I said, Mr. Trump, we met in Hong Kong a few years back, your yacht. And he turns to me and says, yeah, that was a great yacht, wasn't it? How is it for you? He thought I was the guy that actually bought the yacht. But we have him, and he has gained the Republican nomination despite all the opposition. So whether you like him or not, he is a great leader. He has a critical mass of people behind him that has taken him to that level. And against him, we have Hillary Clinton, who we all know very well, who I've met 2 or 3 times as well. And to have gained the Democrat nomination is no small feat either, and she has a critical mass of people behind him. And I think that is the definition of leadership. And when you're talking about leadership, it's that you need to have that critical mass of people that will follow you and go where you want to go. And at the moment, these two are going for the presidency. One of them will win, one of them won't, but they have their own armies there behind them. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a wiser leader than many, said the problem with leadership is the time that you look over your shoulder and find no one there. And that is precisely what has happened to us in Britain at the moment, particularly to David Cameron, who just before he left in June after the Brexit referendum, was being slated as one of the greatest leaders of all time. Leadership is an amoral skill. We often confuse the skill of leadership with the values that it promotes, which is why I'm going to try to unfold an argument in front of you in the next few minutes that democracy, Western liberal democracy, that has moulded the world that many of us are living in at the moment, have got ourselves into a big mess right now, and we're not sure how to get out of it. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are equal in their leadership skills for their present mission, and that's to win the presidential election. There are other leaders, and we should have slides, but we don't, but just imagine them, because you will know them, and think about, as I mention their names, are they good or bad leaders? Nelson Mandela, a good, unifying leader for South Africa at that time. Adolf Hitler, a brilliant leader who turned Germany around from its poverty and was loved by many in this country and in the United States. Henry Ford, the car maker, received the Grand Cross of the Knight's Eagle for his support for Nazism in the 1930s. And other businessmen did too. He's seen though as a bad guy. Mahatma Gandhi, he's seen as a good guy, although Churchill, who we claim is another great leader, loathed him. Gandhi unified India against British rule without firing a shot, and we heard a little bit of the previous speaker about how many members of the Commonwealth fought against British colonialism. Joseph Stalin, he created the Soviet Union under the dream of Marxism by giving housing, hospitals, education from the Baltics to the Bering Sea. But he killed millions along the way, so he's a bad leader, but for somehow in our minds he's not quite as bad as Hitler. And then here in this country we have Margaret Thatcher. I don't know how many of you remember her. A great leader, but a divisive figure in their own country, a bit like Nelson Mandela is or was a divisive figure in South Africa. But generally seen as a great leader, but she won that leadership. She was about to be voted out of office. And if she had lost the Falklands War, or if there had not been a Falklands War, we would have had no Margaret Thatcher. We would have had no revolution with the trade unions and all the rest of it. Popularity of leadership, unfortunately, often comes from war. Maggie, as I call her, taught me a few things about leadership. I met her a few times. One was at a dinner that we had in China after she had left office. And we were sitting, it was a small dinner, there were, I think it was 8 or 10 of us sitting around, and the conversation even back then turned to Europe, as it does now. And she said, America, Britain, we saved Europe, we made Europe what it was today. A friend of mine at the end of the table, wisely or unwisely, said, yes, Lady Thatcher, but what about Russia, the Soviet Union? Without them, we wouldn't have won the war. She turns and she eyeballs my friend for at least 10 to 15 seconds without saying a word. Then she turns back, looks over the whole room, and says, America, Britain, we created Europe, what it was today, and we won the war. And the conversation flowed on. The tip that she taught me about leadership there was that you may be able to see, or there may be both sides of the stories, but never acknowledge that to your voters. There was another story just tangentially when I was a good friend of Carol Thatcher's, and we went to the Chequers evening, Christmas Eve drinks at Chequers. And in those days, the great and the good were there, like even Michael Heseltine was there, Norman Tebbit, the politicians of those days were there. It only lasted about an hour, and Maggie worked the room brilliantly, talking to everybody and that. And then when we left, I had a battered old Citroen then, and I got into it and I turned the ignition key. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. And all the time, the Rolls Royces and the chauffeurs and the Mercedes were all leaving. And suddenly I was left in this huge car park outside of Chequers, just me and my Citroen. I said, what the hell to do? So I got out, opened the bonnet, started checking the carburetor and the this and the that. And the top window flings open and says, Humphrey, do you need a bunk for the night? It was Carol Thatcher. I said, no, Carol, I think I'll be okay. I'll be out of your hair in a minute. And the next thing, the front door opens, and out comes Carol Thatcher, Dennis Thatcher, Carol, and Maggie and a couple of security guys. And Dennis comes up to me, and he says, right, young man, we'll have to give you a push. Get in. So reverse the car out, get it right. And then the Prime Minister, the first man, Carol, and the security guys all get behind him and push. And then it starts, you know, when you bump start a car, it goes, and then it sort of says, Dennis comes around and says, all right, lad, well done, thanks for coming, see you soon. Off they go. I look in my rear mirror as I sort of totter off, and there's Dennis and Maggie holding hands, Carol chatting next door to them, the security guys have sort of melted away. And as I'm about to turn out of Chequers, there's a sort of big hedge there and everything, Dennis's hand sort of goes up like that, doesn't look back, there's a sort of final farewell. And that taught me a lot too, because the Prime Minister was happy to push my car. No airs, no graces, and impeccably polite throughout. Well, regardless of her politics, she kept that critical mass of people around me. Now, to be a leader, the reason I'm pushing on leadership is to see where we are now in the world, but to be a leader, you don't have to actually have a position and a title and a name card. One of the greatest leaders I met ever was when I was coming back from covering a story in Bangladesh, and there'd been a coup or a cyclone or something, and I was in one of those cars that many of you might know well that's hardly got a wheel, there's no windows, and it sort of goes, and the driver's sitting down there because he hasn't got a seat. And we were stopped at some traffic lights on the way to the airport, and in one of those jams, and some kids are asking for money in the window, and suddenly they melt away, and this guy comes up, and he's on one of these sort of boards with wheels that's raised, and his face hits mine. And he's got no legs, he's got an arm that comes out here, and he's got a sort of bone stub here. And he says to me in impeccable English, he says, excuse me, sir, do you happen to be going to the airport? And I looked at him in amazement. I said, yes, I do happen to be going to the airport. He says, might you then have any spare taka on you? Taka is the local currency in Bangladesh. I said, well, and I hadn't bothered to change it, so I did have it. I said, yes. He said, well, would you mind giving it to me? Because you can't use it outside of Bangladesh. I thought, this is a perfect argument. So I gave it to him, a whole sort of bundle of stuff like that, and he managed to wedge it into his arm. And then he's about to go. He says, thank you. He's about to go. He says, have you left enough to tip the porters at the airport? And I said, no, I've given it all to you. He said, you should take some back because the porters need tipping and you can't give them foreign currency. So we managed to get some back out of his thing, and then he wheels himself off into this thing, and you can see that this man controls that junction. The money went to somewhere, but he was in control. The children that were sent out were looking up, and that was his junction. And I talked to somebody about it later, and he said, in Bangladeshi terms, he says that is the least corrupt, the most well-run junction in Dhaka. I'm not sure what we have for our leaders here in this country at the moment. I don't know how many of you can vote here or, as citizens, it doesn't really matter. But we've got at the moment Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. One of them, if you read the press, is a die-hard Marxist. And the other one, if you've been looking at stuff over the past few days, is a xenophobic nationalist. We have a party named after liberal democracy, which is what I like, what I grew up with, called the Liberal Democrats. But you don't see them. I don't know if any of you can know the name of the guy that leads it or anything, but their voice is just not being heard. And then we have these unlikely lot called the Three Brexiteers, of which the most famous is Boris Johnson. Anybody here not know who Boris Johnson is? Nobody knows who Boris Johnson is. Everybody knows who. Okay. And he's now a foreign secretary. And just as I was coming in, I was seeing how he was threatening military action against Russia and asking people to demonstrate outside the Russian embassy, looking for war.
Moment is a question time for him. It was in television before the account. He has to answer a lot of things. Just was the question.
Exactly, just for the previous stuff.
That's right.
Yes.
The question.
So he's what we call a pioneer of what's now being called post-truth politics. Because actually you can't believe a word he says.
Excellent.
He said that all the stuff about Brexit, the 350 million and the single market and the immigration and whatever it is, and none of it, or very little of it, turns out to be true. And a critical mass of it is, such a large critical mass of it is untrue, that it is actually there as a kind of slogan that's gathering people around him, but it doesn't mean anything. And I think that gives a lot of us a great amount of uncertainty, because he has a lot of people following him. And across in America, Donald Trump is doing the same thing. So our Western liberal democracy is producing two people that are actually just an inch away from being the heads of the governments of permanent members, of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, at the UN and other things, who don't give a damn about what is true and what isn't true, who don't seem to have any policies that we can really nail down or discuss. And let's see who they're actually pitted against. Something's working. You have to go to slide number 26, but that might slow me down, and we'll have to see who they're pitted against. Good. Can people see that? Yes. It's called catch-up, isn't it, without the commercial break. Vladimir Putin. And he has pioneered what is becoming a new world order, where the Western system of liberal democracy is being seriously challenged by the autocratic system of big powers. And this isn't ISIS coming out of nowhere, Robert Mugabe, or in Zimbabwe, or a dictator siphoning off money to Switzerland, which is incidentally what a number of British diplomats have told me over the years that Putin is. No, this is not that at all. This is a discussion where Russia and China, which we'll see, we can go to China now, Russia and China, have examined democracy and found that it does not work for them. And if anybody was living in Russia in the 90s, going through the Chechen wars and the corruption and the mafia killings and all that sort of thing, they will find that that is true. So Russia is snapping at Europe's eastern borders with war. And in China, Xi Jinping is being described as the most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping or since Mao Zedong. And he is putting in place plans to oust the United States as the controlling power in the Asia-Pacific. So there are two autocratic powers that do not believe or trust liberal democracy that are challenging the values that we believe in. The reason they're able to do this now is that those values have not worked for so many people. And one more. This is Dongsha Island, a place that one of the South China Sea islands that I went to a few years back, and it's become a flashpoint for war, because China says it wants to control these islands and the waters around them. In other words, the trade routes through the South China Sea, which is one of the biggest maritime passages in the world, and America says it will not let China control those trade routes. It's a bit like Sarajevo in 1914, Poland in 1939. Whatever you have, there is an inexplicable confrontation approaching out there. And then we have, this is one of the bases that China's built, and I'm not sure how much you can see there, but it's basically an island with a runway, hangars, 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 and where it says unknown structures, those are going to be, it's thought, missile bases and all that sort of thing. Next one. And I was up recently, I'm doing a book about this at the moment, which is why it's in my mind, at the Naval War College, which is in Newport, Rhode Island, where since 1884, they have studied the art and science of war. It's one of the great wargaming centers of the United States military. Most of those war games are classified. They're commissioned by various Pentagon departments. They wargame them. In other words, they have a fictional armies, and they fight, and we see who wins. And then that's fed back into the Pentagon. But they did release one about wargaming on the Korean Peninsula, where the Korean Peninsula was called Brown Lands, with North and South Brown Lands. And they found, amongst other things, that it would take 90,000 troops, 56 days, to secure North Korea's nuclear weapons and materials. That's quite worrying. They did a lot of interwar planning with the rise of Japan, a little bit like they're doing the rise of China at the moment. And that it began with Pearl Harbor in 1941, which was known as a Black Swan event. And that's something that, however much planning you do, however prepared you are, something will always come up and bite you from behind. And that's what that was. After that, the Pacific War went pretty much along the lines of what they had planned at the Naval War College, apart from the decision to bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because when they were doing the plans, they didn't have the bomb at that time. And this is one of the guys that I interviewed there, and he threw up the problem that we've got all over the world at the moment. And that is that he told me that a conflict with China is certainly not inevitable. When a power continues to rise, we can find space in the world as long as all follow international law. That's the stumbling block, because there isn't such a thing as international law. It doesn't exist. It exists on paper, but there's no police force and courts to play with it. This is the invasion of Grenada by the United States. Now, there are many things. There's Vietnam, there's Iraq, there's Guantanamo Bay, there's all of those things. There's the Monroe Doctrine, which some of you may know from 1825, when America threw the Europeans out of the Caribbean. This is just one of them. In 1983, they wanted to stop the Marxist government being in power in the Caribbean island of Grenada, and the Americans invaded. It was against the law. But then we go to something that is more than law. This is Saddam's statue prize, and this was the beginning of where the credibility of liberal democracy began to be prized apart. It was not the liberation of Paris, as we had been told. It was the invasion of another country, and I went back and forth there. That's me with the BBC crew there. I think there was one Christmas where we have our security guards and our fixers and our this and our that, and then again out on patrol with the Americans at some stage. There was a time that I went there, which I don't have a photo of, right at the beginning. We were walking up to the Sheraton Hotel in Baghdad. I don't know how many of you might have been there. And there was an American GI and there was an Iraqi walking along, and the American GI sort of takes him, pushes him to the ground, and has his foot on his neck like this. It was not an uncommon sight, but it was the first time I had seen it. It was straight after the invasion. And he's standing like that, and I'm coming along with my press pass and all the rest of it, a white face. So he's got a disconnect of what he's doing down here and who he's seeing here. So he looks at the pass, looks at me and says, "Out this way, sir." I say, "That's a bit rough, isn't it?" And he says, "Well, at least we're bringing freedom and democracy to the people of Iraq." And I think, holy. And this is Iraq at the moment. This was in June, I think, but as you know, it goes on every day. And I get bristles of anger, which is one of the main reason I'm here today talking to you, when someone tells me that Iraqis are better off now than under Saddam. Because they are not, period. And I know some of you in this room might disagree with me, but you see the politicians scuttling away about who supported the Iraq war and who didn't. And one image stays with me. It's not a war story or anything, it's a fixer that I had down in Basra when I went there in 1998 and Saddam was in power. And she was 18 or 19 at the time. She was ambitious, intelligent, spoke fluent English, learning German, wanted to be a doctor, dressed like all of us. And she took me to the university where they were teaching whatever they could under sanctions, and one was a Christian professor, one was a Muslim professor, and they both went to their churches and did whatever they did, in mosques and did whatever they did. And I saw her over the years and saw what was happening to her. And I helped her fill in her medical applications to be a doctor at Basra University. And I went back a few years back and found her, knocked on the door of her compound and went in. She opened the door to the house. She had a baby. She gave it to the guy behind, closed the door, and said, "You can't come here." I said, "I know." I said, "Walk me to the gate." And it was one of those compounds, you know, that, and then the gate's over there. So we walked very slowly. I said, "How is it?" She said, "It's bad." I said, "Can I do anything?" She says, "If I think you can do anything, I will contact you." In other words, don't until... Then we got to the gate, and I said, "How bad is it really?" And she was dressed in the hijab, you know, right through the hijab, right the way through. She lifted it. She was bruised down the face, cut on an eye, and she was crying. And then she said in a very loud voice, she said, "And don't come back here again." So everybody around could hear. Off she went. She was not allowed to study. She was not allowed outside of the house. She had been forced to marry. Her dreams of becoming a doctor in Saddam's Iraq, where women were allowed to build roads and bridges and run hospitals and be in the courts, had been dashed. Now, even if you take that element of it alone, I don't think, and if you take everything else that's happened, if you said back in 2003, shall we go into a country and end up that the women will not be allowed to partake in society, would we have advocated war? And we didn't stop, did we? It wasn't just Iraq. It was rather as if we had sort of knew it was bad, but we couldn't do it. We went in and toppled Gaddafi too, without any idea of who would take over. And when I think of that young fixer of mine, and when I hear people say that Gaddafi must go, Assad must go, Mubarak must go, and all the rest of it, I think, how dare you intervene to say somebody must go without knowing what will replace the dictator? Because these people, as much as we might loathe their system, know the glue that holds their societies together. And I don't think that what has happened in Libya or Iraq or Egypt is better than what went there before. And in the case of Egypt, we in the West were applauding the demonstrations and protests that overthrew Mubarak. Fine, we could see that. It was the beginning of the Arab Spring. But where was that voice of reason that said, it's happened before in Russia, it's happened before in various other places, let's stop it. And then 2 years later, those same protesters overthrew a democratically elected leader. And we applauded that too, because that elected leader was not of the right sort of democratically elected leader. So instead of saying, well, look, we're going to mentor you through this, and we will help you, and we will make sure that the democratic space works, We supported the overthrow, and Egypt is now a military dictatorship. And it wasn't just in the Middle East. In 2014 in Ukraine, protesters rose up against the democratically elected Viktor Yanukovych because he didn't want to sign an EU accession agreement. Sure, he was strong-armed by Russia, but that didn't make his decision any less legitimate. He'd been elected after the pro-Western governments had failed the people with their lack of decision-making and corruption and whatever, and we supported those street protests. We did not show leadership and tell the protesters, look, democracy works in a different way. There's an election in a year. Go back home, go back to your jobs, and throw that man out in elections. And we hailed the new government, not because it was democratically chosen, but because it sided with our strategic aims. So what we've done now, there, in those two incidences, coupled with Iraq, Libya, and all, is that we've actually torn up that ideological flag of democracy, the value systems of democracy that we've been selling around the world for 25 years. And we've admitted twice that it doesn't work. What's actually happened in Ukraine is that there's been a small civil war. Crimea's lost, but more importantly, the beginning of a new Cold War with Russia newly confident and diplomatically and strategically is presently running rings around us. I think I didn't do enough of that. There we go. Yeah. But we still haven't stopped. It's as if we're paralyzed, like deer in the headlights. We're still saying that Assad should go. There's Boris Johnson saying we must militarily intervene in Aleppo to do what? But I don't know, can anybody in this room, and please help me here, name any new leader of Syria? The transport minister in waiting? A defense secretary in exile? Is there a Nelson Mandela or an Aung San Suu Kyi or somebody like that? No. Yet we are still saying that this man should go. I'm not saying that I support him or don't support him. But it's that if you take Assad away now, you are going to have even more death in that country and suffering than we have at the moment. So what we have as a result of this is we have a proxy Cold War developing between America and Russia in Syria, with both sides pouring money in for weapons and troops. Same thing is happening, as I said, over in Asia, but in a different way, without the human interest thing. And look what's happened during the past 20 years whilst we've been obsessed with the Middle East stuff. This is Shanghai. It's shunned our democracy, but it's built this. And it's raised its citizens out. And I don't know if you remember that picture back in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacres, when China repressed its democracy activists and killed its own citizens there. Back then it was hailed as a pariah, so it buckled down and created that skyline I just said, and nothing has changed in that regime. It still locks people up, it still represses free speech, it still rips the crosses off churches, and it denies people the vote. China hasn't changed at all, but we have. This is our Chancellor of the Exchequer, a year ago, George Osborne, now sacked, who hailed Britain's golden era with China. Hinkley Point, the power station, HS2, the high-speed rail, God knows what else. What he's failed to do, and he might be right, it might be good to do business with them. What he's failed to do is explain to me, the voter, as to why his value system has changed so much. And is it that Britain loves successful dictatorships and overthrows weaker ones that are going through bad times? But it's not just China. This is Singapore's skyline, an authoritarian regime, but a member of the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth demands democracy, which means that democracy is not clearly defined at all. Hong Kong. built under British colonial rule, which denied it democracy for many years. And Thailand, where the king is very close to death, I understand today. That's what a great restaurant overlooking the city for the privilege. That is at present a military dictatorship. I just want to go briefly to where we, liberal democracy, has been working over the past 25 years since the end of the Cold War. This is Sierra Leone, a Commonwealth member that we intervened in against a ragtag bunch of drug-crazed, tribal, horrible people. And I went back there some years back to see what we had done in that intervening time. I think that was around 1999. This would have been around 2010 or so. This old rail track that runs out of Freetown to the east, still rusting and decayed, nothing built, and there are no roads between any of the major cities. This is the road that runs between Freetown and a town called Kailuhun. And Kailuhun is where is where the war started. Now, if you're trying to end a civil war and bring people together who suspect or the first thing you do is you enable them to communicate with each other. So you build a road. But we didn't build that road. And as far as I'm aware, we still haven't built it. And if you are living in those sort of conditions, as a citizen of Sierra Leone or one of the developing world countries, you don't want somebody coming to you and handing out a gender equality leaflet or a democracy leaflet. You want someone to build a bridge across that river. And the Chinese have been going in there for the past 10 years, all around the world, building those bridges, building those roads, and setting up the communications that people need to live. We didn't do that. And if we did, we didn't do it enough, because that is how the perception is changing. So what we have now, as I said earlier, is this concept of two authoritarian powers with a critical mass of followers in other countries, or they're gathering them, pitting themselves against us who believe in liberal democracy. And it's that this is General Sir Richard Sharif, who used to be the Deputy Allied Supreme Commander at NATO, has just written this book. What is coming from this, essentially, is that people are confused. They don't feel they have stable or secure leadership in the West. Europe is weakened. America is polarized. We in this country, we don't know what is, the pound is going up and down like a yo-yo. And it does not forebode well for the future, because people are confused. And our value system that we have lived by for so long has been shredded. And I'll just finish, though, because we're dealing with post-truth politics, on a solution to this problem. And there we are. And this is a true story. And the true story is that an American Airlines plane is 30,000 up in the air, and there are 5 passengers on board with only 4 parachutes, and it is about to crash. And the first passenger is a lady that some of you might have heard of called Kim Kardashian. And she says, "I am the most beautiful person in the world. I've just been robbed at knife point in Paris. Americans don't want me to die." So she took the first parachute out and jumped out of the plane. The second passenger was Boris Johnson. He said, "I am Foreign Secretary and a best-selling author, and the world needs me if Britain is to be great again." So he grabs the second pack and jumps out of the plane. The third passenger is Donald Trump. And he says, "I am going to be the next president of the United States. I am the smartest man in the world, and I will make America great again." So he grabs the pack next to him and jumps out of the plane. The fourth passenger was the Pope. And he says to the fifth passenger, who's a 10-year-old schoolgirl, "I have lived a full life. and served my God the best I could. I will sacrifice my life and let you take the last parachute. The schoolgirl turns around to him and says, that's okay, Your Holiness. There's still a parachute left for you. The smartest man in the world, Mr. Trump, he took my school bag. Thank you. That's it.
That was excellent, Sir Humphrey, and of course, working on that again. Excellent for the very informative speech. Now we have a few questions. The first question I would like to ask you. Of course, you spoke about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They are debating. I stayed 3 o'clock morning in the 3 o'clock, in the morning. I stayed to listen to them. I spoke to several foreigners, not British or English, and I said, "What is your opinion?" One told me, as I can see both, they are blaming each other for the stealing, for the thieving, for the tax dodging, for taking all the 30,000, for example, emails there, bleaching it, whatever. They are crook. Two crooks staying fighting for the world first man or first woman. Is that right? Is that the sensible things which they're doing? They damaging each other. Do you think is that, for example, after that, is there any credit going to be left for them? Say, I am the president. I've been touching the genital of the woman. I've been doing that. I've been doing it, and now I'm your leader. Is that right?
It reminds me a little bit of the Rwandan genocide. Not because of the killing, but because of what was allowed to be said before it. And the radio stations were full then of the fact that you should pick up a machete and go and kill a cockroach, which was, I'm not going to name them, but that was for one side. And that went all over, and that's what people did. In this case, that Sheikh Ramzi, is that the debate has debased to such a level that people in their millions and billions think it's all right to refer to other people like they are. And that is always on the cusp of violence. And it is particularly because of this that you're talking, and in a way what is happening here in this Brexit debate, because it's getting vicious and polarized, is that the mature democratic debate, or democracy that should lead to good governance, is shredded now, and the sort of exchanges that we're hearing at these things are similar to the sort of corruption that we accuse other people of when money changes hands backwards and forwards. And I'm not sure how we get out of this, because our leaders are, as I say, like rabbits in headlights. I talked to somebody in the States the other day just about anything. I said, is there any plan, I was talking about South China Sea, but is there any plan, long-term strategy for this sort of thing politically? And he says, well, 10 years ago, we said that we couldn't think more than a week ahead, and now we can't think more than a day ahead. Whereas Putin and Xi Jinping and people like that are thinking 20 years ahead. So I can see a situation where you have order in China and another war in Europe, particularly with the right-wing political parties and sentiment coming up again, Hungary, Poland, and places like that.
Any questions?
Can we have somebody who hasn't asked questions? Because we've always had the same. You're welcome.
Now, I just want to refer to Trump and Clinton at the present time, with the credibility issues that are coming out from it. I think, in a way, if you take the two people together, Trump, I find it obnoxious, since when he divorced Ivana Trump originally, she was a lady, she does a huge amount for charity, she gave him the credibility that he now seriously lacks. And he, for me, my first issue would be here is a guy who's head of, wanting to be the head of the United States and hasn't paid any tax. For me, that would be the first thing, that he's not a credible prime minister to have. Clinton, on the other hand, I think what she did, I'm not condoning it, may have been inadvertent. However, she has done a lot of good. She has been in the system. To blame her for her husband's ongoings is a little bit, I think, unfair. It's like saying your husband has been embezzling money, therefore you are a bad one. She has done more good if you compare it to Donald Trump. And I think for me, if you look what's going on in Brexit, it's the, what do you say, the pot calling the kettle black. We're both laughing stocks and it's shameful.
Next. Your Excellency, yes.
Ah, Italiano. Come sta? He never speaks.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your very interesting speech. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for your very interesting speech. I would try to pose this question. In your opinion, do you think this situation of uncertainty and of fear which creates this kind of new leaders you mentioned in your speech is linked to the end of ideologies? I mean ideology as a system of values which gives some certainties, some points of reference. In your opinion, what kind of relevance you can attribute to this fact historically? Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, that is a good one. I think essentially most ideologies or religions or whatever it is that drive something originate from a group wanting to do something. And what happened to democracy is that we thought that it was the best way to build those bridges and have a stable government, and it's turned out that it hasn't worked like that. I think that what is happening in Russia and China and other parts of the world, like Rwanda, for example, or Botswana, these are one-party states and that sort of thing, they haven't yet formulated into a new ideology. If you look at Marxism or that, and how that evolved in Russia, so you ended up with Stalin, and then that moved forward for 50 years until it collapsed for how it was. It originated because the poor weren't getting what they needed. If you look at what ISIS is doing in a fairly ham-fisted way, it's because of the poor in the Islamic world are not getting what they need. And you know, these things sort of come around, and I think it's a great, because I never thought of democracy as an ideology. I think it probably was seen like that, or it was a colonial whatever, but not as an ideology until recently. In fact, now that anybody that's against Brexit is called anti-democratic, you know that that's being hijacked. And I said to Sheikh Ramsey on the way here, I said, I'm beginning to understand what a Muslim felt like at 9/11 when their culture was being hijacked by extremists, because that is what is actually happening here. And I think it's going to get worse up until January the 20th when we have a new president. If it's Hillary Clinton, I think everything might then begin to settle.
Can I have could you permit me to say something about leadership? I feel that why, in a way, we're getting the leaders that we deserve. We should really demand people who have values. We have to question people. You know, if you go to an exam as a kid, you know, if you copy, you're out. You miss that you know, grade, whatever it was. You miss that exam. You miss maybe your A level if you're caught cheating. So therefore, if it's demanded of our children, how can we not demand of our leaders? We should be, you know, we should be saying, excuse me, I don't think Republicans should have this person or Democrats should have this person. If there should be minimum level of values in people that we should trust, you know, because our values are based on money. The one who has more money can do more campaigning, etc., and get there and get more advertising, whatever it is. This is not, money is not value, money is a means. You know, so therefore, our world is upside down. It's upside down because we're not demanding values. We should demand values, and then things will come around. That's what I think. I don't know what you think.
How do we do that?
For example, there should be laws, I mean, decided collectively, how we choose our leaders.
But we have Congress, we have Parliament, we have our courts, and they're all not doing what you just said.
Yeah, it is exactly why we should question the whole thing. We should say, excuse me, I am Margaret, I don't want to be ruled by this person. You know, I mean, the voices will increase. If we're not really given power. We think we're democratic, we're not. If Donald Trump is elected, it's not at all democratic, is it? Just because of few numbers more or few numbers less.
I mean, there is a move, I don't know where it'll go, is that if you get up in court and say something that is untrue, you can be convicted for perjury.
That's it.
Why is it that you can actually say that we're going to give 350 million to the National Health Service and not be convicted of something?
Exactly.
I think that will gather pace, but it'll take years. It'll take years.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my customer. I want some ladies.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Vincent from Nigeria. Please, back to your seminar on democracy and war. I have a kind of, I do imagine that do Western powers actually have any kind of remorse towards their influence in overthrowing the government of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya or Iraq, and then another maybe power where these people has been overthrown in order to, you know, introduce democracy. And to me, I look at those countries as a breeding ground for ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and even though Boko Haram, who now stand as a threat to world peace. And looking back when these people was in power, nothing like that happens. But now we have introduced democracy, but it is other way around. Please, what is your opinion? Or do they even have any, you know, a kind of remorse? No, we have done a wrong thing, or just like the Brexit exit that is happening now in Britain, please.
Is anybody else? Because we can take...
Anybody?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm American. Yeah, not a Trump supporter, unfortunately. I wanted to note kind of the tricky linguistics of values, because I think the voting bloc that supports Trump and even the kind of analog of voters that supported to leave for Brexit are also values voters and consider themselves so in kind of deeply entrenched religious values. But beyond that, I guess I just wanted your perspective on who you think the actors would be at this point to kind of enforce any sort of, even though they don't exist, imagined international law or standards around how we can hold leaders accountable if they're not doing it. Thank you.
I'll go backwards. The international law, it's a big problem. The thing to keep your eye on is the ruling in July of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the South China Sea, because that ruled against China, and the only people that can enforce it is the United States. And if they enforce it, they have to enforce it through the barrel of a gun. So do they want? It's a bit like, you know, the cop coming to your house, and does he really want to arrest you if he has to sort of handcuff you, or does he want to do it peacefully? So international law, as such, when I said it doesn't, it exists on paper. But you know, it's Boris Johnson saying he wants to put the people that are bombing Aleppo up for war crimes. Now, it just seems to me very short-sighted. Okay, at some stage we're going to get the pilots of these planes that have bombed this, but we don't have any solution to end the bombing. Exactly. So there's a whole thing about this use of international law as some sort of rhetoric which doesn't actually help the diplomatic and strategic element of finding peace and moving forward. Wasn't your point was about democracy generally, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The role of the Western power in overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi and, in order to introduce democracy in some of these countries, and which has now become a breeding, ground for these international terrorists that,
Is there any remorse?
Yeah. I mean, that's what the point is, as I mentioned on that China thing with Georgia, is that we haven't admitted it. So we still don't have anything else but that. Otherwise, we would work out a way to change the Assad must go formula. And we don't have that. I'll just tell you a quick story before we wrap about Libya and Iraq. Similar stories is that there was a PR company called Edelman here. And just after Gaddafi had been killed, or around the time that he went, they approached Edelman and they said, the Libyan opposition said, could you please write our constitution? And they said, well, we won't write it, but we'll draft it for you. Just tell us what you want the constitution to be. We can make it look right. He said, no. He says, we're not going to, we just need it written so that we can get the best possible aid from the West in. They had not any idea. And we had a similar thing down before the invasion of Iraq. There was a big country house down in Surrey that the Americans, the British went to, and they had the Iraqi opposition. Do you remember that guy Chalabi and all of those guys? And they had them up and said, right, transport, education, health, this was going to be the ministers of the new things for a long weekend. And it got to around Saturday evening, and the CIA and the Brits got together and said, well, what's come out of it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And they thought, well, we can't have nothing come out of it. So they got rid of those people, and they jotted on the back of the envelope the manifestos for those various departments. This was the British and the Americans, without the Iraqis. And I went to see an Iraqi transport minister, I think it was, transport minister, after I was interviewing him, not the one that was there, because they all sort of got killed and moved on. And I said, okay, sitting down, can you tell me your budget for the roads for Iraq for the next 3 years, and what is your main road to be built and that? He had no idea, because all that was needed for him was to have that job so that he could take the money. And if we then turn around and say this is democracy because we've got films of people voting, we're kidding ourselves, and that's what we've been doing. And if you look at the statistics of infant mortality, literacy, all of that sort of thing, in Libya and in Iraq, before we went in, it's very high. Very high. And I don't know if you remember the pictures of the Libyans, when there's, there's utes they're going backwards and forwards up. And look at the quality of the road signs and the roads. They weren't the roads in Sierra Leone. These were proper roads with proper signs telling everybody how far it was to here, there, and everywhere. And that's what we destroyed. And so when I just showed you the China pictures there, when Deng Xiaoping was sent into internal exile, like these guys have been in exile waiting to go to, he spent his time not sort of working out how he could fill his coffers, but working out, okay, when I get brought back, which I will, when and how do I open up Shanghai? When do I open up Guangzhou? How do I sell the message of the economic reforms? Does the GDP of our country need to be for that? He had it all in his mind. He'd spent 5 years working that out whilst he was in house arrest internally. And that's why, if you compare that to the leaders that we've had coming up in the Middle East and North Africa, we know now why we've been backing the wrong horse, as it was there. I have to wrap now, but thank you very much, everybody. Oh,
One last remark.
okay. You can talk.
It's because for the video. I'm one of the ICT's PhD students. Wanted to thank you for such an enlightening speech. I just had a brief question. Have you ever been to Kazakhstan?
To which stan?
Kazakhstan?
Kazakhstan, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
And what was your opinion of it briefly? Like, if you could give some remarks.
I've been to Kazakhstan a number of times. I went to Ust-Kamenogorsk. Are you from Kazakhstan? Yeah, okay. Ust-Kamenogorsk, Almaty, and I did the train journey through. 3 things very quickly. Firstly, you're in Stalin's Soviet dream, right? So whereas geographically around that you've got the subcontinent, where people are living in straw huts, wherever you were in this vast country that's something like 20 times bigger than France or whatever, in the middle of nowhere, you had concrete houses, you had a drainage system, you had a hospital, and you had a school. I'm not backing Stalin, but you know. Second thing is when you go to Astana, which is in the middle of where the gulags used to be, and you drive in from the airport, it's like Ozymandias. These skyscrapers come up, all sorts of weird patterns and everything, and this is it. And I talked to the foreign minister there, and we were doing a bit about nuclear. You know, Kazakh's nuclear. So Kazakhstan gave up its nuclear weapons in the early 90s. I said to him, what happened when you gave up your nuclear weapons? He said, well, it was very difficult because we had plane loads of people coming in wanting to buy them. I said, who? He said, we had the Saudis and the Pakistanis and the Iraqis with their planes stacked full of dollars. And I said, well, you could have been a very rich man. He probably was anyway. You could have been a very rich man. Did you make the right decision? And he said, well, look, of course we made the right decision. We're now wealthy and we're doing this and we're building skyscrapers and we're getting inward investment and all the rest of it. Kazakhstan's got a succession problem that it's not dealing with well. But those are the 2 points on Kazakhstan.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hand together for the...
Thank you.